3.5 years, authors, producers, publishers Ron Wallace and J.J. Wilson have gone underground in Tulsa, Oklahoma, tirelessly researching, investigating, and documenting one of the most significant historical discoveries ever brought to the forefront of either American or African American history. They've written and published a new book called Black Wall Street, based on true historical facts about a small, highly prosperous, and very sophisticated African American community that existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the turn of the century. Presently, American history instills into the minds of the youth of all races that African Americans have no other history than that of slavery or civil rights. This rich and very vital history of Black Wall Street will instill instant pride, multicultural awareness, improve self-esteem, and build a strong character in our youth. Another very significant point should be made. It is that when youths from other nationalities see the documented historical, economical achievements of these African Americans in Black Wall Street, they will inevitably begin to view them in another light, hopefully reducing the ugliness of racism so prevalent in society today.
In 1921, one of the most devastating massacres in U.S. history took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The 1921 Tulsa race riots. The black community of North Tulsa, called Black Wall Street, or as whites called it, Little Africa, was completely burned to the ground in a mere 12-hour period. Over 1,300 businesses and homes were destroyed and completely ruined. 10,000 people were left homeless in the night, and to this day, no one knows how many people actually died. Accounts range from 500 to 1,500 men, women, and children, both black and white. This senseless massacre of human life was very carefully covered up by high city officials. When Black Wall Street was destroyed, a major black economic movement that would have affected all black communities in America was crushed and completely halted. Black Wall Street was the most prosperous and most thriving black community in America during these times. It defined the word nepotism to its ultimate form. These highly organized blacks worked together in the same manner the Jews, Japanese, and Iranians work together in this day and time. Black Wall Street was so prosperous that white oil men would come across to the black community to borrow large sums of cash in order to keep their businesses afloat. This very powerful black movement would have had an effect on blacks all across America, socially and economically, but 3,000 card-carrying Klansmen would not allow that to happen.
What you're about to witness will astound you. It will most likely affect you very deeply, no matter what race, creed, or color you are. And just maybe, this film will make us all take a second look at our fellow man and not hate him or her because of the color of their skin.
This is an actual account of the worst race riot in United States history. It's not a pretty story, and it's not being told for its shock value or to reopen old wounds. This material is presented because it happened 70 years ago to another generation whose story is pertinent to this contemporary generation. The true facts were completely covered up and kept from the American public. The date was June the 2nd, 1921. The place, Tulsa, Oklahoma. After the bombing, the Tulsa World headline read, "Dead, estimated at 100, city quiet. One of the bloodiest race riots in the nation's non-military history had begun. The spark for the tender was ignited on Monday, May 30th, 1921. Here's the story.
During the early 1900s, Archer Street was intentionally designed to divide the city's north from the south side of Tulsa. Blacks were forced to remain on the north side, and whites enjoyed their separatism on the south side. Laws were passed to make sure that whites and blacks remained separated.
Coast to coast, from hate, and discrimination, and arrogance, and those were probably the underlying reasons. They manifested themselves in organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. But you can't blame the riot on one or two or three specific incidents. The environment is what caused it. You have to keep in mind that in 1921, the majority of the Oklahoma legislature were Klansmen. Almost every city and county official in Tulsa County, Oklahoma, was elected with either support of the Klan or they were Klansmen themselves. In those days, the Klan would have parades in downtown Tulsa, wearing their white sheets and their pointy little hats to fit their pointy little heads, that would last 4 to 5 hours in length. Now visualize the number of people that were involved in a parade that would last 4 to 5 hours. And all these people came from Tulsa. When you had a parade in Tulsa, a lot of people come in from other counties. But you also have to remember that 1925, there were 5 million card-carrying Ku Klux Klansmen in this country. So what was going on in Tulsa was probably the same thing that was going on in an awful lot of other cities. And if the riot hadn't happened in Tulsa, it probably would have happened someplace else. The difference between Tulsa and some other city is that we know how bad it got and where we've gone since then has been a mark of our progress.
As I sit here, I wonder, with blacks fighting for equal rights and integration in other parts of the United States at that time, was it really a good idea for blacks living in Greenwood to integrate?
But what happened by 1921 was not so much what happened on the black side, but what happened on the white side of the city. Because you had a lot of veterans coming back from Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry and the Argonne Forest, and they couldn't find jobs. And a lot of these were white, uneducated, lower economic class folks. And when they came back to Tulsa, the Klan milked that resentment that they held for those black, prosperous businessmen. And the Klan did the same to them that the Nazis did in Germany in 1933. As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting. You can make an analogy here that is historically profound. We had a microcosmic experience with the Nazis. The Nazis in Germany in 1933 blamed the Jews, and they persecuted the Jews, and they segregated the Jews, and they created ghettos for the Jews. And that's how they built their power, but they built their power on the disenfranchised and the disenchanted Germans. Well, the Nazis took over an entire country. The Ku Klux Klan, in this case, largely took over an entire city. And for that matter, to some degree, the entire state and maybe the region of the country in which they were strong. But they played on the hate and the fear and the envy and the jealousy of many of these whites who had felt that the country owed them something because they had fought in World War I. And here you have blacks who possibly didn't fight in World War I and were very prosperous. And you had the seeds for that kind of conflict economically. Now socially, you had a different situation. Oklahoma is a very unique state in the sense that it's the only state in the Union that was settled the way it was. This was Indian territory. It wasn't even a southern state in the Civil War. For that matter, it wasn't even a northern state. It was a state that was fought over by both sides. In fact, there were 69 battles fought in Oklahoma, largely between northern and southern Indians. But when the state was settled, it was settled by land runs. Benjamin Harrison opened up chunks of the state, and people just ran over this land and plotted out their portions. Now, why is that significant in terms of the riot? It's significant because an awful lot of those folks that made those land runs were Southerners whose farms and lands and plantations had been burned by Sherman and the Union Army when they went through the South. They had no homes left, so they came west. And when they made those land runs, they brought in Southern culture with them. As a result, what you have here in Oklahoma is a microcosm of the United States. The northern half of the state is more metropolitan, in fact, politically, more Republican. The northern half of the state was settled by farmers from Kansas, which was largely Union territory. The southern half of the state was largely settled by folks from the South, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas. And the state pretty much splits that way in terms of politics and economics and social development. But when you add that extra economic jealousy and envy to it, the Ku Klux Klan had a breeding ground. And that's the reason they were able to hold parades that lasted 4 to 5 hours at a shot. There were an awful lot of people that were more than willing to hate blacks because they represented something they wished they had. Little Africa was possibly the most prosperous area that blacks have ever collectively developed any place in the world.
Oklahoma was regarded as one of the cleanest states in the nation and cherished its reputation as being called God's country. or the Bible Belt of America. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, as I first stated, my husband predicted this that Sunday night at church. Them days we had BTUs. They about cut them out now, and we don't have no BTU. But he made a public statement and told them that this was going to happen. But we didn't know. We hadn't seen no sign. But after church and after we went home, several men, young men and stuff, you know, they get all shook up and everything. We had a good, dear policeman at that time, we called him Bonnie Cleaver, Uncle Bonnie. He was down there trying to corral them because the trouble was arising, and we didn't even know that, with this black man and this white woman. And they down there showing out down to police station and all, and he was riding this big old horse, and he was telling them, you know, it wasn't going to be none of that. But they had guns and everything, and some of them come clear out as far as Latimer Street. That's where we lived. And running by that, men, get your guns. Get your guns. Get your guns.
A very nice feeling to see, to live in a role model community. In other words, you could see people doing on every level that looked like you, so you could set your sights anywhere that you wanted, and you felt secure. I don't really remember seeing any other cultural group except Native Americans and Mexicans.
Right.
I don't ever remember seeing them.
You didn't have much interaction with whites then?
No, absolutely not.
All right, but your dad did.
Yes.
Yeah, I saw them at the store when we went to the store.
Yeah.
All right, and so they would come to the store to sell product. Then.
Right.
That's true.
And so that was the extent of pretty much what you had to do with the white community.
No,
did the folks ever talk about the problems that existed?
Well, my mother did talk about religion sometimes, because my mother had been brought up in the Episcopalian church.
Mm-hmm.
And when she came to Muskogee to teach, she was told that she could come to church, but she couldn't commune. And that was outrageous to her, because she had been born in Brownsville, Texas, and they allowed her to commune there.
Sure.
So she immediately joined the the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was all black.
Mm-hmm.
And we knew that because Mother had told us about that incident. So we knew there was friction somewhere, but we never experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
There were people working in the neighborhood. There was a brickyard right across the street from us. There were many whites that worked in the brickyard across from our home.
Right.
But there were milkmen who drove drays, you know, with a horse and so forth and so on. There were firemen who were white.
Yep.
If there was a fire, they came and put it out. Of course, they didn't have what they have now to put fires out with. So we saw them, and there was a little train that came in there, Sand Springs train that came every day. Those fellows were white. But there wasn't any friction that we knew of. I'm sure things happened, but they didn't happen to us.
What you see here is the very famous Mount Zion Baptist Church, a congregation that survived the 1921 riots and managed to rebuild on the exact same location where it was bombed and completely destroyed exactly 70 years ago.
In 1921, a man's word was his bond. You measured the masculinity of a man by how much he kept his word. The congregation of the Mount Zion Baptist Church sticks in my mind because the year before the riot, the black congregation took out a 20-year mortgage and built this brand new church. And the Klan burned it to the ground. But instead of running out on their mortgage, instead of telling the bank, you're just going to have to take your losses, that congregation took out another 20-year mortgage and paid off both mortgages simultaneously. That's character. There were other heroes too. Many of the whites in the southern part of the city
had black employees. And those employees had become almost extensions of their family. In fact, a lot of Tulsans were raised by black domestic employees. And when the riot erupted, many of those families hid those blacks in their basement at great jeopardy to themselves, because if the Klan had ever found out that a white had hidden a black in their basement, the white family would have been persecuted, if not horsewhipped. Probably the two most singular heroes out of the riot was the Tulsa County Sheriff and the Tulsa County Black Deputy Sheriff. Willard McCullough was the Tulsa County Sheriff at that time, and he was the only sheriff in the whole state that had black deputies. His chief black deputy was Barney Cleaver. And you got to keep in mind, when that riot erupted around Tulsa County Courthouse, there weren't more than maybe a dozen deputies in that building. And Willard McCullough stood on the south steps of the Tulsa County Courthouse and told a mob of several thousand Ku Klux Klansmen who were heavily armed that he was not going to release Dick Rowland. Barney Cleaver stood on the north steps of the county courthouse and told the black crowd that they weren't going to release Dick Rowland. Well, you put yourself in the position of a white county sheriff in a southern state in 1921, facing several thousand Ku Klux Klansmen, and you don't have more than maybe a dozen deputies to back you up. And Barney Cleaver's on the north side of the courthouse telling a black crowd the same thing. I don't know much about Barney Cleaver or Willard McCullough before or since then, but I can tell you this. On May 31st, 1921, they became, maybe earned the right, to become world-class cops.
Sort of a happenstance. What happened was that my father owned a Mosler safe, and everything in the store was destroyed, but he was down there in the rubble one day, and he kicked the safe, and it seemed to be all right. So he worked the combination and opened it, and everything was intact. And because it was the only safe in the neighborhood that was that safe, a lot of people who lived by various means that weren't may not have even been legal used to bring their money to keep. So and they always put their name on a paper bag, and so he went around and gave everybody their money back. And they said, "You don't mean that our money's still good?" And there were quite a few people who had left their money with Dad in the safe, and then he had a little money in there of his own. And so that was okay. He had some bonds in there, and those were okay. And that's what he used to make a tour of the United States with Mr. Gregg, the Secretary of the Y. They went to black churches in Washington, St. Louis, places like that, to tell people what had happened, because the Scripps-Howard newspapers had decided to keep it quiet. To make
so they did get out there to tell the story.
Well, they did, only to black churches, however.
Yep.
And
so it takes it till now to get this to people in general, to let them know
and at the
really
time,
what happened.
Scripps-Howard and the Hearst newspapers were so powerful till they had people following Mr. Gregg and Dad when they went on the speaking tour. And I guess they probably would have done something to them, but they were clever enough to just read quotations. When they got to the place where they were describing all these dastardly things that had gone on, they would quote what somebody had written in a magazine or a newspaper instead of telling it as a first-person story. And so the FBI, or whatever preceded the FBI in those days, wasn't able to say they're inciting to riot because they were quoting from a paper.
Reverend told me, so we got to go. And I said, no, I don't want to go. I don't want to go out there. He said, yeah, you got to go. See, remember, he had told the people he couldn't hardly get me out of the house. So I gave him a little argument about it, but I had to go. And I just had on my barefoot sandals and had a head rag on my head. And he said, let's go. We can't stay here. Said, we got to keep moving. So he got out there and he went to preaching to the people. See, we was very thickly settled in on both sides of the streets, and all the houses was burnt down on my side, on this side and that side, but two houses, my house and another. All the rest of them was burnt down. See, all those little people, every chance they got, they would stick fire to the house. And all that fire was burning, and folks was hollering, some of them and running. And my husband told them, said, don't run, said walk, and stay out in the opening where they'll see you. And so when nobody gets shot.
No, what had happened to our father and our brother, you see, they still weren't turned
when you went home,
no, they
just the ladies,
yeah,
just the children.
And things were very much upset and disturbed. And the thing that bothered me the most was that I had seen them set fire to my doll clothes. And I thought that was the last straw. The doll clothes were hanging on the line because the lady that used to help us had washed all the clothes. My grandmother was a fine seamstress, and she had made the doll all kinds of good things. And then to see them take a torch and set them on fire on the line.
So sad. For children's
it was.
Things.
I mean, children, you know, cherish their possessions. And a child who's never seen any hatred.
Right.
The Klan was extraordinarily powerful in Tulsa in 1921, but then again it was extraordinarily powerful throughout Oklahoma. As a matter of fact, during the 20s, Oklahoma impeached and convicted 2 governors, allegedly, of course, for other charges, but it was an open secret that one of the principal reasons they got impeached and convicted was that they were anti-Klan. The majority of the Oklahoma legislature were either Klansmen or supported by the Klan. But then Oklahoma was not unusual. States all across the country had that kind of influence in them. But in Tulsa County itself, there was a rather unique situation that developed. In the late teens, the Glenpool oil field was roaring. And that's just west of Tulsa County. An awful lot of money poured into this city. And the whites, who were the big oil men, lived on the east side of the Arkansas River. The roughnecks who worked the rigs lived on the west side. Well, there wasn't enough housing on the west side, so a lot of the roughnecks would come over to the east side and live in rooming houses on 12-hour shifts. A lot of people said that was due to the housing shortage. A great degree it had to do with the working cycle of a roughneck on a rig. Because roughnecks work 12-hour shifts on rigs. The point here is that a lot of the money that poured into Tulsa, that helped build Tulsa into the beautiful city it became, was also poured into the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan became extraordinarily well financed. With that sound financing that they received from those oil men who were sympathetic to the Klan and who were in fact effectively manipulating the lower white economic classes to their own benefit, the Klan in Tulsa had a lot of money to do a lot of things that other Klan claverns didn't have that kind of support to do. For example, they had a building, a headquarters here in Tulsa. It was called Beano Hall. Now, what did Beano stand for? It stood for Beano Jew, Beano nigger, Beano Catholic. I think it's ironic that Beano Hall eventually evolved into a pig barn. There were not only lynchings, but there were other forms of persecution. The Ku Klux Klan was real big on providing character guidance, attitude adjustment, and behavior modification on anybody they disagreed with. Not only including blacks, but whites who they regarded as violating their standards. It wasn't uncommon for a white person, for example, who might have been going out on his wife, to be hauled out of his house one night and tied to a tree and flogged by men dressed in sheets. Many blacks, however, were lynched. They were lynched by such organizations as not only the Ku Klux Klan, but the Knights of the White Camellia. There were all kinds of super secret little organizations that were self-appointed vigilantes. As a matter of fact, the Justice Department itself created the American Protective League during World War I and made it function under the FBI, which at that time was not the FBI we know today. It was a politicized FBI. But the American Protective League was largely an organization of volunteer civilian white men designed to ferret out any individuals of Germanic descent in Tulsa County and watch them to see if they conducted any espionage or pro-Kaiser activities during World War I. The American Protective League was formally disbanded after World War I, but that will give you an idea of the kind of mentality that existed then. But to address your question, yes, there were lynchings. And to give you an example, several weeks before the Tulsa riot, in Wagner, which is a small town east of Tulsa, a black man had been arrested on a minor charge and incarcerated in the Wagner County Jail. And that night, the sheriff, or the guard or deputy, whoever was responsible for the jail, conveniently went out to get a sandwich, just as a crowd of people dressed in white robes entered the jail, took the man out, put a noose around his neck, wrapped the other end of the rope around the bumper of a Model T Ford, and dragged him down the middle of Wagner Main Street. And that sort of thing didn't just happen in Oklahoma. That sort of thing happened across the country. And there were many lynchings before the riot, and I'm sorry to say there were many lynchings after the riot. But there weren't any lynchings in Tulsa County after the riot that I'm aware of.
That my mother had actually shed tears. I had never seen her cry, and I had never heard her speak in that loud a tone.
Yeah.
And a little thing like burning down a town was quite small to me in comparison with my shock to see this absolutely strong, immovable, immutable, invincible person with tears rolling down her cheeks. So that was really the riot to me.
And so then coming back home, it was the determination to make things, to get things back to where they were?
Well, we naturally, we hoped we could. We didn't know how we would, because, you know, with the store completely destroyed. At that time, Papa didn't know that the insurance wasn't going to pay. I mean, everybody assumed their fire insurance.
An act of God.
But everybody assumed that
that was an act of God?
That their fire insurance would, you know, cover at least, you know, the basics. But I had many nightmares after that. I couldn't sleep at night, and they were really worried about me because it was such a shock to me. I think Irene and Leslie knew about prejudice, but I didn't.
Right, right.
The interesting thing that happened during the riot was that the riot lasted almost all night of May 31st, 1921, and into the early morning hours of June 1st, 1921, before law enforcement authorities were able to get anything under control. The city police didn't want anything to do with trying to control the Ku Klux Klan. As a matter of fact, the chief of police, a man by the name of Gustafson, confiscated black vehicles, gave them to two of his crony police officers on the Tulsa police force, which I might point out with some justification was a politicized police force at that time, not the police force that Tulsa has today, which is a first-class department. But the point was, in those days, he gave those confiscated vehicles to those 2 police officers who went out and sold them to whites, and then they shared the profit. Chief Gustafson was later indicted for this and removed from public office in June of 1921. But there were many other indictments too. And many of these indictments were the byproduct of National Guard boards of inquiry. Now, what happened in the riot, and this is fascinating, was that here you have a major war going on in the downtown portion of Tulsa that erupted and moved north into the north part of the city, eventually wiping out the north part of the city, devastating it totally. And yet the mayor, none of the city commissioners, called the governor. Now, at that time, we only had one 40-man ambulance company in the Oklahoma National Guard stationed in Tulsa. The governor at that time didn't know there was a riot in Tulsa until the next morning, because no city or county official notified him, with the exception of the county sheriff. The county sheriff sent one of his black deputies through the north part of the city toward Sand Springs. He got to Sand Springs to a telegraph. And keeping in mind the telephone lines were down, the telegraph lines were down, the railroad tracks were torn up, there were Ku Klux Klansmen standing on roadblocks trying to catch blacks who were trying to escape the city, and there were refugees as far away as Kansas City and Wichita and Muskogee, Oklahoma. That deputy got to that telegraph and telegraphed the governor on behalf of the county sheriff that there was a riot in Tulsa and law and order had broken down. J.B.A. Robertson, who was governor at the time, sent the adjutant general, who is the top military officer in the National Guard in Oklahoma, to Tulsa. The adjutant general arrived and immediately sized up the situation as being exactly what the governor had been told by that deputy. And the adjutant general mobilized the Oklahoma National Guard, and they sent in guard units from as far away as Enid and Lawton, Oklahoma City and Muskogee and places like that. And a lot of people attribute the troops that arrived were federal troops. They weren't federal troops. Federal troops were never deployed here. This was the Oklahoma National Guard that came in. Many of the survivors who I interviewed when they were still alive told me, frankly, the black survivors, they told me, frankly, they wouldn't have been alive that day if it hadn't been for Oklahoma National Guardsmen. Because the Guardsmen came in and the very first thing they did was declare martial law and threatened to shoot anybody who was found armed. They set up internment compounds to protect black refugees, because black refugees were scattered all over the city, their homes were burned, they had no place to go. And so they set up internment compounds around the city in various parks and places like this.
So, but I didn't tell you, one of my husband's best friends was killed that day while we was in that rush. See, he told him not to run and don't get in close places, because they would just shoot in that bunch. This fellow was named Willie Lockett. He and my husband were great friends, and I said to him, "So where are you going, Willie?" He said, "I don't know, man, so I'm just going." And he was on a horse, and they said this was one of their favorite horses of the Lockett family. So T.I. told him to be careful and stay out in opening. But he was killed that day.
Every single insurance company that had a policy covering any kind of damage to homes or commercial businesses or industry cut and ran on their insurance policy because a riot wasn't included. The federal government and state governments didn't have programs in place to compensate citizens for being the victims of a breakdown of law and order. So effectively, the citizens who lived in Little Africa took the entire loss. The problem was that when we're talking entire loss, we're talking everything. There was no FDIC then. They might have had their money in a bank, and if the bank was burned and the money stolen, there was no way to recoup it. Jewelry stores in Little Africa were stripped clean. Furniture was taken out of homes. Everything was gone. And the homes were burned to the ground. So when we're talking about refugees, we're talking about refugees that had nothing left except what they carried on their back.
Yes, was a good friend of mine. She and her husband, they gave birth to a little baby that night, and you know, I guess they didn't have nothing to put it in because there wasn't no conveniences. They put it in a shoebox, newborn baby. But some people, you know, some people that day, you couldn't stop them from running. We had to walk because that was our safest way. But these people was running, and seemed as though that they set this box down where this baby was and to rest because people got awfully tired and they couldn't find it. It was stillborn, already dead. But they didn't want to throw it away. They wanted to take it home and then have the film. But they didn't get to. And there was so many things that taken place that day. Now we lost our best doctor the next morning. But they told me that he had, he stood somewhere there in one of those buildings down by the, where that little 3 Cardinal place is on Greenwood. You know, it's a ruined house on that side, and you know, something like that on this side, and then the brickyard. Well, they said he stood along there, and he just mowed quite a few of them down.
And by 1925, you couldn't tell. Well, there was still some rubble on Archer Street, but for the most part, you couldn't really tell that it had been a completely devastated community.
And they did
People
it
had built houses. They had built houses, and they built stores, and they built hotels, and put back an elementary school. The elementary school had been completely bombed out, but they had
so they were
back
with their schools and back with their pride, and
yes.
And nothing was going to stop them.
That's the way they felt. Now, they had a lot of trouble building because somebody thought of the idea of making an ordinance that no one could build a 1-story house. If you built, you had to build 2 stories on a certain amount. You see, that was a zoning that was passed surreptitiously.
Right.
To keep them from building back on that spot because the town really wanted to expand out there. But there was an attorney, B.C. Franklin, and a couple of other lawyers, black lawyers, who went to court and won that case that the people owned their land. They could build back on their land, whatever they chose, and they didn't have to live by these specifications that the zoning people had put in that were really artificial. You know,
this is over 70 years, right?
Yes.
Since the fire.
Yes, it's been a long time.
What do you think now about a fire? About being in Tulsa as a little girl then?
Well, I guess looking back, I'm very glad I had that kind of start where I never had to wonder whether or not you could do something or accomplish something.
Yeah.
There were so many people who had and did, and knowing people, when you're a child and you know people who look like you, who own airplanes,
yeah,
it does something for you.
Yeah.
So that it was in many ways a very privileged, we weren't rich, but it was a very privileged kind of experience. It never occurred to me to think that Mexicans or Native Americans were inferior or different, or that we shouldn't, because I had always been brought up, you know, where they were around, and
sure.
that's our, so it wasn't a matter of talking about it. I think it has been a very good investment because there's been so much hate and dissension now that if I had understood more, I would be a much different person, a much meaner person.
All right.
There were witnesses that an airplane crossed the black community by air and something was thrown out of it. There were explosions. The problem is that you don't have a cause and effect direct relationship, because Tulsa was piped by natural gas in those days, as it is today. And many of the homes were already burning. So from a more precise perspective, there isn't hard proof that a plane came over the black community and dropped bombs on the black community. However, there have been a couple of things we've been able to establish. There was a plane over the black community. There were things thrown out of it. There are some interesting conclusions you can reach from some of the available evidence. First, it wasn't a government plane. There were only about a half dozen planes in the state at that time that belonged to the government. There was no Air Force then. The Air National Guard didn't exist. And there were about a half a dozen biplanes at Fort Sill. None of them took off the ground during this period. But this was the period of barnstormers. It wasn't uncommon for a pilot who learned how to fly in World War I to have a biplane and to fly around the country and do tricks at state fairs and maybe take somebody up for a couple of dollars. That, in all likelihood, was what happened then. That a barnstormer who had his own airplane actually flew over the black community. Now, if he threw out anything, and if it was a bomb, it's perfectly understandable how it could have worked, because it doesn't take very much to make a bomb, particularly if you're a veteran of a recent war that had just ended.
Greenwood was soon labeled the Black Wall Street of America. It consisted of highly educated black doctors, lawyers, PhDs, merchants, oilmen, and entrepreneurs.
The interesting thing about this particular situation is that in North Tulsa in 1921, prior to the riot, there existed an area called Little Africa. And that was a mark of respect. The black business community was extraordinarily prosperous. As a matter of fact, possibly the best minds in black America had migrated to North Tulsa in the late teens and early 20s. They built a commercial and business establishment so prosperous that it rivaled any place in the world. In fact, the main street of Little Africa, Greenwood, was euphemistically referred to as the Black Wall Street. There were millionaires that lived there, and some of the architecture of some of the old homes in North Tulsa today represent that particular period.
What do we tell people today about, in reacting to that? What do we learn from it?
Well, I think two things. One is that the newspapers were able to keep it secret. In fact, to perpetrate the lie that everybody got restitution. Nobody got any restitution of anything. But they could fabricate a lie and it would be accepted as truth, and nobody worried about it.
Still true.
And
Still true.
Yet the people survived, but not because, you know, they got any kind of justice. And I think one thing that we might have learned by it was that if people really have a strong will and a strong feeling for each other, that it's amazing what can be accomplished. And I'm particularly grateful for the education I got in Tulsa. When we went back to Booker Washington High, it was a fantastic school. The teachers were so well trained, and they couldn't get jobs anywhere else, of course, and so they taught there.
Yep.
And when I went to Columbus, I was going to say when I went to Columbus, the teachers did not believe that I had been taught all I had been taught, you know, because they thought South, you know. And I remember even in math, the teacher said, "Can you do quadratic equations?" This is ninth grade. I said, "Well, which method would you like?" And she said, "What? How many methods do you know?" And I said, "Well, 4." She said, "In ninth grade, you can do 4 ways of quadratic equations." But
we were talking about, and have been talking about, Black Wall Street, the fact that it existed. Let's talk just for a minute about the nature of the book. What is the book about?
The book is about the most prolific and wealthiest black community in America. And we tell that story through the eyes of an African-American oil man and a Jewish merchant. We thought it was very important that each one of these characters represent 10 people that you read in this book. We wrote the book very visual. We wrote the book the way kids think. We put undertones in the book to make them turn the pages, and that's what's exciting about the book. The book tells you the story as though you're right there.
And it does, too. And by the way, more than the book, you have a videotape?
We have a videotape out called Black Wall Street, the Holocaust. It's 55 minutes long. It tells you the story of that day of that riot, June 1st, 1921.
Tell our viewers briefly about the children's book.
The children's book is Black Wall Street, A City Made of Gold. That was written by my wife and Annette Wilson, which my wife is Latricia Wallace, and it gives positive images, and we're after positive images in this story. And an old man, about 80 years old, told me that if you write this story, Ron, please do not write about the hate, because the person you may be writing about may be your cousin.
All over the country, our inner city communities are suffering. We're asking 1 million African Americans to stand up and take back your community. To book a Black Wall Street Town Hall meeting, give us a call at 1-800-527-7299. Call today.
I wish we had more time, and we don't. Sorry we have to close. On behalf of Ron and Latricia Wallace and the Black Wall Street team, I want to thank you for being here with us. It was wonderful. Thank you for the important role that you've played in American history. We salute you for what you've done, for your country, the story that you've told, and thank you. For those of you who have been watching, remember that we can begin to change the world, but we can only do it by changing ourselves and then passing it on to those around us. So pass it on, and God bless you till we meet again.
What words of wisdom could you give kids what in terms of following some of your positive patterns and perspectives about discipline to keep them out of harm's way? What could you do? What could you lend the young kids?
I'll say this directly to the camera. If you're young and you live in America, whether you're white, black, red, green, or whatever, you have a lot of adversity, and you know what those adversities are because you're the one that's young. You're the one that's suffering all the pains of degradation for being young. If you want to make a difference, figure out what it is you want to do, where it is you want to go, and don't let anybody, under any circumstances, deny you.
Wake up now. Riots in the streets are successful exception of an African American. Such prosperous black people working together for the good. They were keeping all the money's in their own neighborhood. Black Wall Street, Black Wall Street, Black Wall Street, Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street was a place to be, full of hope and prosperity. They were and have so much to gain.